Jordan, welcome to KubeFM. For people who don't know you, can you tell us about who you are, what you do, and where you work?
Sure, thanks, Bart. I'm Jordan, originally from Greece. I currently live in Amsterdam, and I'm working for an agri-tech startup named Aurea Imaging. Basically, we are deploying edge devices to orchards that do all the AI inference on the edge. We process most of the data there, we do the heavy lifting there, and then we send the data to the cloud and visualize it in some sort of portal that gives insights to the grower. That's more or less in a nutshell.
Okay, not your average, not your average job, but an interesting one nevertheless. In terms of Kubernetes tools that you've worked with or that you find interesting, is there anything you'd like to share about regarding that?
Actually, we came across K3s, this lightweight distribution of Kubernetes, about 3 years ago in KubeCon. We saw a similar use case with us. It wasn't in the agri-tech space, but it was still quite similar in terms of the application. We were also at the same time thinking to redesign our architecture. Basically, we based our architecture before that, to give you a bit of context, in a Docker container with a single Python service, sort of microservices using Python's multiprocessing library, but we didn't have enough orchestration. We didn't have control over our app. We didn't know the state of our app. So, given that our system had constraints that are not really typical of cloud native servers, for example, K3s was an ideal case of using Kubernetes in such applications. We eventually tried it. We had a proof of concept. Of course, there was quite some learning curve for the team to learn, as we weren't all Kubernetes experts. But hey, the alternative would be to go with ROS, Robot Operating System, and C++, and all these embedded tools that also the team didn't really know. So it played out really well at the end. So we basically split it properly, our application, our code base into microservices, did use the K3s single node cluster, and deployed basically all of our applications there. And that works pretty well until now. It's the third year that we are using this architecture. It's pretty easy to scale. It's pretty easy to debug, to identify issues, to troubleshoot what's going wrong, to take the logs and see from which service does the bug occur. It's pretty easy to identify the root cause of issues.
On the subject of upgrades and change risk, so Kubernetes upgrades get a lot of attention, but changes underneath the cluster can still be scary. When something changes at the node or OS level, how confident do you feel that it won't break workloads?
Well, there's always a chance that something might break, of course. Recently, we've been playing a little bit with different OS. We use NVIDIA's Jetpack, which is based on Ubuntu, but all these, as we are quite dependent on NVIDIA's ecosystem, we have to keep up to date with the industry standards. We have to use the latest tools for all the GPU-enabled inference that we do. So upgrading NVIDIA's toolkit means also upgrading the OS. The cluster remains the same, of course, and our application has to run. So apart from some routine upgrades that we do in the application, we haven't seen much problems. The main issues come when something changes in the networking, which is a bit more tricky. It's a little bit more related to our application that is not a typical cloud server. Networking changes quite often. It can be that we connect our device to a hotspot and things might completely break. So we have to adjust our Kubernetes cluster to be robust against that.
And on the subject of running Kubernetes outside the cloud, more teams are running Kubernetes in places that don't look like a hyperscaler. If you've worked with clusters outside the cloud, what feels harder or more fragile compared to managed environments?
So the main difference that I would say compared to classic cloud applications that we have is our device is connected to a tractor, to the tractor's battery. So that's where it gets its power from. So our main shutdown mode is a hard power cut, basically when the driver switches off the engine. And that's the tricky part. That's again only in our application, but I think it's quite a challenge that we have to deal with. How does the cluster deal with these shutdowns? How do the pods connect back to to the initial state. And networking, of course, can be tricky sometimes when IPs change, when priorities, DNS priorities change. So yeah, there are some edge cases that we have to take into account.
And just as a piece of practical advice for people that are thinking about, working with Kubernetes at the edge, are there any things that you would say, knowing what you know now, you would definitely recommend if you're starting out with this, these are some good things to keep in mind?
Start simple, of course, as with every software advice. Build a simple cluster, understand a bit of the networking layer of Kubernetes. I think that was the most tricky part for us, because basically everything else is pretty well documented. You can have access to the API documentation of Kubernetes, pretty standard components. If you have worked with it in the cloud, I think it's pretty standard. It's mostly about how it plays with its surroundings, how it's bound to the network of the OS. And basically, the most important thing is how does your cluster interacts with the system, with the OS.
And what's next for you, Jordan?
Next for us as a company, we're not focusing so much on the edge side at the moment. We're mostly focusing on scaling our data pipeline, creating a data lake, and then we want to have, during the spikes of our traffic, which always occur in spring, as we are heavily dependent on seasonality. Orchards bloom in April in the Netherlands usually. We're trying to streamline this process to be much smoother for the customer, to have results faster. So we're basically redesigning the cloud side, still using Kubernetes there, but not in the same way as in the edge side.
And if people want to get in touch with you, Jordan, what's the best way to do that? Reach
out to me through LinkedIn at Aurea Imaging. I can also send you my email if needed. So yeah, everyone can find me through Aurea Imaging. We're like 20, 25 people working there. On LinkedIn, you will find my name, my face.